Alright y'all, so today in this video I want to talk about a original canceled version of a movie that we could have gotten instead of the final version of the movie that we got. More specifically, I'm talking about the film Over the Hedge. Now, as we all know, it's a pretty underrated and highly, in my opinion, fantastic animated film from DreamWorks Animation that released in 2006. One of my favorite, personally, of the DreamWorks animated films, and obviously, I think cemented its legacy. But doing research for the movie and kind of digging into the backstory and kind of talking about other versions and looking a little bit on the production side of things of how the movie got made, I kind of found out about this really interesting version of the movie that we could have gotten that predated the DreamWorks version. A version of the movie that would have been made by an entirely different studio, possibly different animation style, different voice actors involved. It could have been an entirely different adaptation as a whole. So in this video, I'm going to be talking about the canceled Fox Animation Studios version of Over the Hedge that predated the DreamWorks version, that was originally the version of the movie or adaptation that we were originally supposed to get. I thought this was a really fascinating topic. I'm a huge fan of Over the Hedge, and I really think the whole history of it's really fascinating. I think it's kind of crazy. We almost got a completely different version of it from an entirely different studio, and I just found that concept really fascinating. So in this video, I'm going to kind of make a really quick little bit of a discussion on it. Like all my other canceled videos, I'm going to give you a little bit of background on it, the history of it, so to speak, the content of what it, like I said, the content of what it was possibly going to be containing, all the information that we known on this version of the movie that would have possibly been in the final product, why it was ultimately canceled, and why we got the final DreamWorks version that we got in 2006 at the end of it. And of course, my overall opinions on this lost and canceled version of Over the Hedge. So let's get into this crazy adventure, so to speak. So let's start out with the background. Now, if you didn't know, Over the Hedge was actually created originally as a comic strip. And there were some pretty huge differences from the film and the comic strip, if you didn't know. For example, the family, so to speak, of animal characters wasn't really in the strip. There was the turtle Vern, there was the raccoon RJ, and there was Hammy the squirrel. But the other characters weren't really in there, pretty interesting enough. There was also a little girl character that apparently spoke to the animals and stuff, which was quite fascinating. Now, the comic strip was created by Michael Fry and T. Lewis, and it was published starting out in 1995. And from what I heard, it did pretty decently when it first came out the gate. So much so that, like I said before, in the kind of start of this journey to get the comic strip adapted into some kind of animated film, it apparently caught the attention back in 1995 of animation producer / writer Jim Cox. Now, Jim Cox, he has worked on a few things. He worked apparently on some story development on Beauty and the Beast, and apparently contacted the creators via email about possibly doing an adaptation. They've, like I said before, started to work on an adaptation. A partnership between Cox and the creators was quickly created, and eventually, Cox and the creators would basically go to different studios and pitch an Over the Hedge adaptation. And apparently there was 3 studios that were really interested in doing it. Now, there was Fox, there was Jim Henson, and there was DreamWorks. So these 3 studios were really interested in doing a adaptation of the comic strip, so much so that apparently a bidding war broke out about who was going to be able to get the rights to do an adaptation of Over the Hedge. And, the bidding war basically happened. And while apparently the creators were really rooting for DreamWorks to possibly take over and get the rights, eventually Fox Animation, or more specifically Fox itself, won the rights and got the rights to do an adaptation of Over the Hedge. Now, why did they basically lose? Obviously, this was early DreamWorks. I think they were just starting out. I think they only been alive as a studio for about 2 to 3 years. So they probably just didn't have the capital to really compete with a big studio like Fox. So Fox ultimately won the right to do an adaptation. And that's really where the Fox version of Over the Hedge started to begin. And, like I said, it would kind of start development. Now, there's kind of different versions of it, too, so to speak. Tim Johnson, who eventually be one of the co-directors on the DreamWorks version, was kind of frustrated about it. Apparently, he was one of the co-directors on the DreamWorks film Ants, which, if y'all remember that one, shout out to y'all. But even back then in 1998, he had an idea of doing the movie, and he was quite frustrated that he didn't get the chance to do it because at the time, Fox Animation was doing it. Pretty interesting stuff. Now, there's kind of two different versions of this story, so to speak. I'm really just gonna kind of combine them together, and kind of give you my opinions on it, obviously. But let's get into it. So, after Fox Animation had acquired the rights around 2000, they basically started to work on an adaptation. Now, apparently, the idea for the film, at least starting out at Fox to do it, was basically conceived when Don Bluth and Gary Goldman showed the comic to the animation head, Chris Meledandri. I'm probably saying that last name incorrectly. And he was impressed so much by the comic strip's humor, and basically in the bidding war already mentioned, acquired the rights to do the strip as an adaptation. He later asked the screenwriting duo of Jeffrey Price and Peter S. Solman to write the screenplay for the film. So there was, like I said before, some work done on the Fox version of Over the Hedge, interesting enough, but it seemed like it was starting to kind of languish a little bit in development, and might have not happened. Now, there was many things that caused its collapse. Now, I already mentioned some of the people that were going to be involved with this, and there's kind of been different reasons given to why it didn't happen. Now, there was another executive producer that was at Fox that was really championing this version of the movie that happened. For example, his name was John Jassine, and he was really championing to do this version of the movie at Fox. He was really pushing for it, and at the time, it seemed like really early pre-production was possibly to do it. Now, in terms of animation style, what this version of the movie could have possibly been? Well, we don't entirely know, but there was many different ideas being considered at some point. For example, at one point, it was possibly considered to be done as a 2D animated film in terms of the style, but it'll be kind of done in similar films like Titan AE, which I will get back to that film later in this video, and also maybe Anastasia, where it was going to be a traditional 2D animated film, but they were going to use digital colors and CGI and 3D objects to kind of mix in and make it look a little more realistic. So it's going to be kind of a hybrid style. And while, like I said before, we just don't know how much work was done on this version of the movie, and my best guess, that was probably what they were going to do with this. I don't see them doing a full-on CGI animated version for the Fox animated version, so to speak. Just because if you look at the Fox Animation Studios films, all of them have been 2D/3D animated. So it most likely, this version of the movie would have been that. Now, in terms of narrative, we really don't know. Like I said, it probably was pretty similar to what we got in the final film. But for what we know, it was less of a central narrative and more accurate to the comics. And what I mean by that is, the comics were kind of a bunch of skits and action sequences and a lot of jokes, but there wasn't really a central core narrative needed for a film. And apparently the script or whatever they had or treatment that they had for this version of movie at Fox was basically that. They didn't really have a central narrative, so to speak, as far as I know, for the Fox version of the movie, and it was just a kind of a compilation of certain skits and scenes. And there wasn't really a central narrative. So we have no idea if RJ would have had an arc in the movie, or there would have been other characters that would have learned something. We don't even know. But it's kind of crazy stuff regardless. But yeah. Now, in terms of characters and what they would have been, it's kind of unclear. We definitely know that the three characters from the comic strip, Hammy, RJ the Turtle, Vern, would have been in it. In terms of the other characters, we don't quite know. It's very well possible, though, the idea of like other animals and kind of the bigger animal family, so to speak, actually might have came originally from the Fox version. but we don't really know, and we just don't have a lack of information, so to speak. But yeah. Now, in terms of what happened with the Fox version, was there also any other possible developments and other potential details on this? Well, sadly, we just don't know too much beyond those very much superficial details. And it sounded like the movie just really didn't get too far at Fox. From the articles and research I've read, it seems like once it got at Fox, it kind of languished for a while. Like, people were hired on to work on it, but the project kind of was one of the many other projects that were kind of in really early development at Fox Animation that was kind of languishing. They were just kind of fidgeting their thumbs and that. Now let's get into why this version of the movie was canceled. Well, there was kind of a few different reasons, and mostly it happened outside of this version of the movie's control. I mentioned earlier there was an executive producer called John Jossi. He was one of the people at Fox Animation at Fox really pushing for this adaptation to happen, and basically he was kicked out of the studio. I'm assuming part of layoffs, part of cost cuttings, or maybe he could have left, but he was out of the picture. And when you have a studio executive that's really pushing for your movie and then they leave, your project is kind of doomed at that point. So he left, and then Fox Animation entered a disaster red zone, so to speak, after that. Now, there was brief ideas of even considering to do it at Fox for a live-action kind of Garfield animated, like a CGI live-action version, which thankfully it seemed like that idea was really early on scrapped. So, like I said, they were just kind of thinking about ideas, and it was kind of languishing in really early development hell. But that being said, what happened to this version was basically, beyond the executive producer that had to leave, the Fox Animation was not doing so hot as a studio itself. They made their next film after Anastasia was called Titan AE. Now, I've seen Titan AE. It's a pretty solid animated film, quite underrated, but it's more infamous because you've probably heard how much of a bomb it was. It was a huge bomb. It reportedly lost the studio tens of millions of dollars. It was ridiculously expensive, and it was ridiculously not profitable, and it created a huge loss for the studio. And that was kind of the death knell of this version of the movie. Basically, after Titan AE, it basically killed, alongside other early development projects that were happening at Fox Animation Studios, basically killed the project. Titan AE bombed, and eventually Fox laid off about 300 of their 380 employees a few months later. And I believe like a year or two later, they basically just shut down the studio entirely. And that was it. That's basically how it got canceled. Outside circumstances, Titan AE caused the collapse of this version of Over the Hedge. Now, how did it end up getting at Paramount, and how the hell did we end up getting the film that we got? Well, Jeffrey Katzenberg, the head of DreamWorks, as we all know, he really wanted to do the adaptation, and when Fox got the rights to it, he actually predicted that Fox was not going to be able to do it. And once they were not able to do it, he basically made a firm statement, "I will do it." So he was already really gearing up and trying to get his hands on the rights to do this movie. And basically, after the whole shuttering of the studio was about to collapse, they kind of just sold the rights to DreamWorks, kind of auctioned off a lot of their projects, and DreamWorks quickly picked up the project after that because they were so eager to do it, and that's what happened. And, that's kind of the beginning of the final film that we got. Now, interesting facts about the film that we got in terms of production that could have been different from the final film. It was originally considered also to be a 2D film, but they kind of switched from that style early on. Even at some point, discussions were being had that it could be some kind of claymation version of the movie, because they apparently had some contracts with some claymation guys at DreamWorks. But eventually it was decided they were going to do a sort of squash and stretch technique and make it fully CGI animated. And there's, like I said before, I'm not going to go into the full development, but there was also some other things. There were some delays. I believe Viacom, I think, bought DreamWorks, and that kind of caused a delay. There's this whole thing with the distribution rights. I believe Paramount ended up having the distribution rights to the final film. I think originally Fox did have them, but I think they were sold off later on. And eventually, after some time, after some really interesting casting decisions, like, believe it or not, RJ was originally supposed to be Jim Carrey. He actually voiced lines. But eventually, we got the final version of the film from DreamWorks in 2006. And, the rest is history, so to speak. So, yeah, that was basically all the information I could possibly find on the Fox version of the movie. In terms of other, things beyond the screenwriters, beyond, speculation and stuff, and other comments people have made and people involved, did it reach any concept art stage? We really just don't know. Did it reach any kind of significant scripting stage? We just don't know. I'm going to be honest with you, I don't think it ever got that far. I mean, it probably reached some kind of treatment phase, and they were definitely discussing it, but I don't know if it reached a significant stage in terms of concept art, at least in my opinion. Now for my thoughts on this version of Over the Hedge that we could have gotten, the Fox Animation Studios version of the film Over the Hedge. Well, on one hand, I think Fox Animation, it was really a shame what happened to that studio. I think most of the films, they had a very limited film selection, so to speak. I think they only made 2 or 3 films, but both of them were really solid. And I think a 2D/3D style could have been very interesting for Over the Hedge. But I am ultimately glad that, they decided to go with DreamWorks instead. It seemed like they were more passionate about doing it. It seemed like from the very beginning, the creatives were more leaning towards DreamWorks anyway. And I think, the animation style they chose, which was a 3D animated version, was really good. I think the film turned out great. The animation holds up for the most part. There were some iconic scenes. And I think the story decisions were better off for the most part. Because, like I said, we just don't know much about what this version of the movie from Fox would have been. But from what it sounds like, it was less stitched together. It was more like the comic. It was less centralized in its narrative. And I like the fact that in the DreamWorks version, they really tighten up the narrative. They basically focus on RJ's story, his arc, and all this and that. And I think it made it for overall better narrative. So I think, while it would have been very fascinating to see more of this, and I think, like I said before, maybe some lost media of this thing could be found, I am ultimately happy we got the film that we got in 2006 with DreamWorks Over the Hedge. So yeah, that was kind of the interesting story of the Fox Animation Studios of the version of the movie that we could have gotten. Very fascinating. Probably a topic that many of y'all didn't know was actually a thing. Just kind of a cool little fun fact that I found out. And hopefully y'all enjoyed the video. And yeah, alright y'all. I'm going to sign off for this video. Peace out, y'all.